The chandelier above the mahogany table cast a golden glow over the room, but the air was thick with something heavier than wealth. Nathaniel Vance, the titan of Lancaster Enterprises, stood at the head of the table, his tailored suit pristine, his face unreadable. The room was a fortress of power, CEOs, investors, and magnates, their laughter sharp, their eyes sharper. They'd gathered to celebrate a merger that would reshape the financial world, a deal Nathaniel had orchestrated with ruthless precision. Champagne flutes clinked, but the sound felt hollow when he raised his hand. Silence fell like a guillotine. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a photograph, its edges worn, its colors softened by time. He held it up, letting it catch the light. A little girl, no more than 6, sat by a campfire, her face lit by flickering flames, her eyes wide with wonder. The CEOs leaned forward, their curiosity piqued, but Nathaniel's voice cut through the room like a blade. "This is Lily," he said. "My daughter." The words landed like a thunderclap. Every face froze. The man to his left, a silver-haired tycoon with a reputation for cruelty, dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor, but no one moved. Nathaniel's eyes, usually cold as steel, glistened with something raw, something dangerous. "I didn't know she existed," he continued, his voice low, almost breaking. "Not until 6 months ago. And when I found her, I learned what I'd done." The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the weight of his words settled. A woman in a crimson gown, her diamonds glinting, pressed a hand to her chest, her breath shallow. Nathaniel didn't look at them. His gaze was locked on the photo, on the girl whose smile seemed to mock the empire he'd built. "I met her mother 7 years ago," he said. "A woman I didn't deserve. A woman I left behind. And Lily, she's paid the price for my sins." He set the photo on the table, and it sat there like a verdict. No one dared speak. The man who'd built a fortune crushing competitors, who'd never blinked in the face of betrayal, was unraveling before them. "I'm stepping down," he said, and the room gasped. "This deal, this company, it means nothing compared to her. I've spent my life chasing power, but I've lost the only thing that matters." He turned to leave, but not before his eyes swept the table, daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. The door closed behind him, and the silence lingered, broken only by the faint crackle of the fireplace. The CEOs stared at the photo, at the girl they didn't know, and something shifted in the air. It wasn't just Nathaniel's confession. It was the question it left behind: what had he done to her? And why did that single image, a child by a campfire, feel like it could topple an empire? The city was a different beast 7 years ago, its skyline jagged with ambition, its streets alive with the hum of dreams and desperation. Nathaniel was younger then, hungrier, a man who wore his arrogance like a second skin. He was 32, already a name whispered in boardrooms, his company on the cusp of greatness. But greatness came at a cost, and Nathaniel paid it without hesitation. He didn't believe in love, only leverage. Relationships were transactions, and he was a master at closing deals. It was late autumn, the kind of evening where the air bit at your knuckles and the city smelled of rain and regret. He was at a gala, one of those glittering affairs where the elite preened and plotted. The ballroom was a sea of black ties and sequins, but Nathaniel stood apart, his presence commanding even in silence. He was there to secure a deal with a rival firm, but his mind was elsewhere, restless, searching for something he couldn't name. That's when he saw her. She wasn't supposed to be there, not really. A server, her uniform slightly too big, her hands trembling as she balanced a tray of champagne flutes. Her name was Clara, though he wouldn't learn it until later. Her hair was pulled back, but a few strands escaped, framing a face that was too soft for a place like this. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, unnoticed by the titans around her, but Nathaniel's eyes followed her. There was something about her, a quiet strength, a flicker of defiance in her gaze, that made him pause. She stumbled, just a step, and a flute tipped over, splashing champagne across the marble floor. The room didn't notice, but Nathaniel did. He was at her side before he could think, his hand steadying the tray. "Careful," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. She looked up, startled, and their eyes met. For a moment, the gala vanished. There was only her cheeks flushed, her breath catching. "Thank you," she murmured, and the way she said it, grateful, but not groveling, stayed with him. They didn't speak again that night, but he watched her. He saw how she worked, how she smiled at guests who didn't bother to look at her, how she pocketed a broken glass to avoid trouble. When the night ended, he found himself lingering, hoping for another glimpse. He didn't know why. He wasn't a man who lingered. Days later, he saw her again. It was chance, or so he told himself. He was leaving a meeting downtown when he spotted her at a bus stop, her coat too thin for the November chill. She was reading a book, her fingers tracing the pages, oblivious to the world. He could have kept walking. He should have. But he didn't. "Need a ride?" he asked, pulling up in his sleek black car. She looked up, surprised, then wary. "I don't know you," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. He smiled, the kind of smile that usually got him what he wanted. "You do. I'm the guy who saved your tray." She hesitated, then laughed, a sound so genuine it caught him off guard. "Fine," she said. "But only because it's freezing." That ride turned into coffee, then dinner, then nights he couldn't explain. Clara was nothing like the women he knew. She didn't care about his wealth, his status. She talked about books, about the stars, about a life she'd left behind in a small town. She worked 3 jobs to pay for her mother's medical bills, and she did it without complaint. Nathaniel, who'd never known struggle, was fascinated. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve, a flame he couldn't resist. One night, under a sky heavy with stars, they sat by a campfire in a park just outside the city. She'd insisted on it, dragging him away from his world of glass and steel. "This is real," she said, tossing a stick into the flames. "Not your skyscrapers. This." He watched her, the firelight dancing in her eyes, and for the first time, he felt something he couldn't control. "Your trouble," he said, half joking. She grinned. "Good. You need some trouble." He kissed her that night, and it was like falling. He didn't know how to stop. For weeks, they were inseparable. She'd sneak into his penthouse, leaving notes on his fridge. He'd show up at her diner, pretending he was just passing by. But there was a shadow over it all. Nathaniel's world didn't allow for softness. His partners, his rivals, they saw weakness in anything that wasn't power. And Clara, with her laughter and her dreams, was a weakness he couldn't afford. He started pulling away. Meetings ran late. Calls went unanswered. She noticed, but she didn't beg. "If you're done, just say it," she said one night, her voice steady but her eyes wet. He wanted to tell her he wasn't done, that he couldn't imagine being done. But he didn't. Instead, he said, this was never going to work. She nodded, like she'd expected it, and walked away. He let her go, convincing himself it was for the best. Months later, he heard she'd left the city. He didn't look for her. He buried himself in work, in deals, in the relentless climb to the top. Clara became a memory, a flicker of warmth he'd snuffed out. He told himself he didn't regret it. He told himself he'd forgotten her. But he hadn't. And 7 years later, that photo of Lily, his daughter, her daughter, would prove it. 7 years ago, the city was a labyrinth of light and shadow, and Clara navigated it with the quiet resolve of someone who'd learned to survive. She was 24, her life a patchwork of late shifts, hospital visits, and dreams she tucked away like old photographs. The diner where she worked smelled of grease and coffee, its neon sign flickering like a heartbeat. She wore her exhaustion like a second skin, but her eyes, bright, unyielding, betrayed a spark that refused to die. She was no one to the world, just a server, a daughter, a woman scraping by. But to Nathaniel Vance, in those fleeting weeks, she was everything. It started with that gala, the night she didn't belong. The ballroom was a gilded cage, and Clara felt like an intruder, her borrowed uniform scratching at her skin. She moved through the crowd, invisible, her tray a shield against the wealth that surrounded her. When she stumbled, when the champagne spilled, she braced for humiliation. But instead, there was Nathaniel, sharp jaw, sharper eyes, his hand steadying her tray like he'd done it 1,000 times. His voice was low, almost kind, and for a moment, she forgot where she was. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. He didn't smile, but his gaze lingered, and something in it made her heart stumble. She didn't expect to see him again. Men like him didn't notice women like her. But days later, there he was, idling in his sleek car at her bus stop, his offer of a ride both reckless and irresistible. She should have said no. She knew his kind, rich, restless, dangerous in ways that didn't leave scars. But the cold bit at her bones, and his smile was warmer than the November air. "Fine," she said, sliding into the passenger seat, her book still open in her lap. He glanced at it, a worn copy of The Alchemist, and raised an eyebrow. "Chasing dreams?" he asked. She shrugged. "Surviving them." That ride was the beginning, a crack in the wall she'd built around herself. Nathaniel was a storm, all intensity and charm, but he listened when she spoke, really listened, like her words were worth more than his empire. Coffee turned into late-night drives, then dinners in places she'd never dreamed of entering. He'd watch her, amused, as she studied the menu, her fingers tracing the prices. "Order what you want," he'd say, and she'd laugh, ordering the cheapest thing just to spite him. But he'd order for her anyway, dishes she couldn't pronounce, and she'd eat, pretending she wasn't falling. They were opposites in every way. He was glass towers and calculated risks, she was cracked pavement and stubborn hope. He spoke of markets and mergers, she told him about the stars her father used to name, about the mother she was losing to illness. One night, by that campfire she'd insisted on, she handed him a stick to toss into the flames. "Make a wish," she said, half teasing. He looked at her, the firelight carving shadows on his face, and said, "I don't believe in wishes." But he tossed the stick anyway, and when he kissed her, it felt like he'd made one. For a while, it was perfect. She'd slip into his penthouse, leaving notes on his fridge, "Don't work too hard, rich boy *", and he'd find her at the diner, sliding into a booth like he belonged there. He'd tease her about her apron, and she'd fire back, calling him a spoiled prince. But there was a tenderness beneath it, a fragility neither acknowledged. She'd catch him staring, his guard down, and he'd look away, like he was afraid of what he saw. She didn't push. She knew men like him didn't stay. But she hoped. God, she hoped. When he gave her a thin red bracelet, woven from thread he'd bought at a street market, she laughed at how out of place it looked in his hands. "What's this, a proposal?" she teased. He smirked, tying it around her wrist. "A reminder," he said. "If you ever need me, just say, champagne." She rolled her eyes, but her chest ached. She wore it every day, even when the threads began to fray. The end came quietly, like a tide receding. He grew distant, his calls shorter, his excuses sharper. She saw it in his eyes, fear, not of her, but of what she made him feel. She wasn't part of his world, and his world was a beast that devoured anything soft. One night, in his penthouse, she faced him, her voice steady despite the crack in her heart. "If you're done, just say it." He looked at her, and for a moment, she thought he'd fight. But he didn't. "This was never going to work," he said, and the words were a knife. She nodded, her throat tight, and left. The bracelet stayed on her wrist, a ghost of what might have been. She didn't cry until she was alone, in the diner's back room, the smell of coffee clinging to her skin. She told herself it was better this way. Men like Nathaniel didn't change, and women like her didn't get fairy tales. But weeks later, when the nausea started, when the test showed 2 lines, she sat on her bathroom floor, the bracelet digging into her skin, and whispered, "Champagne." He didn't come. Clara left the city soon after. Her mother's death was a wound that wouldn't heal, and the city held too many ghosts. She moved to a small town, where the air was clean and the stars were bright. She named her daughter Lily, after her mother, and poured every ounce of love into her. The bracelet stayed on, a reminder of a man she'd never forgive, but couldn't forget. She worked as a baker, her hands dusted with flour, her life small but steady. Lily grew, her eyes the same shade as Nathaniel's, her laugh a melody Clara clung to. 6 years passed, and Clara thought she'd buried the past. But one day, a letter arrived, forwarded from her old address. It was from a lawyer, representing Lancaster Enterprises. They were hosting a charity gala, and her bakery had been recommended. Would she cater? The name Lancaster hit her like a slap, but she pushed it down. It was just business. She'd deliver the desserts herself, stay in the shadows, and leave. She didn't know Nathaniel would be there, didn't know he'd see her across the room, didn't know he'd pause when he saw the red bracelet, still frayed, still hers. That night, as she set out trays of pastries, she felt his gaze. She kept her head down, her heart pounding. When he approached, his voice was the same, low, commanding, but softer now. "These are yours?" he asked, gesturing to the desserts. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He signed for the delivery, his hand brushing hers, and for a moment, she thought he'd say something. But he didn't. She left, her chest tight, and told herself it was over. But it wasn't. Not for Nathaniel. Not for Lily. And not for the truth that was clawing its way to the surface, ready to shatter everything he thought he knew. The gala was a blur of crystal and ambition, but for Nathaniel Vance, it was a reckoning. He stood at the edge of the ballroom, his glass untouched, his eyes fixed on the woman who'd slipped through the crowd like a shadow. Clara. The name hit him like a forgotten promise, stirring something he'd buried 7 years ago. She was different now, thinner, her face etched with a quiet resilience, but the red bracelet on her wrist was the same, its threads frayed but unbroken. He'd signed for her delivery, their hands brushing, and the air had crackled with something he couldn't name. She'd left before he could speak, but the weight of her presence lingered, heavy as regret. He returned to his penthouse that night, the city's skyline glittering beyond his windows, but all he saw was her. The bracelet. The way her eyes had flickered with something, fear, anger, or maybe just exhaustion, when they met his. He paced, his mind clawing at memories he'd locked away. The campfire, her laughter, the way she'd looked at him like he was more than his empire. He'd let her go, convinced it was strength, but now, standing in the hollow of his success, he felt like a fool. The next morning, he called his assistant, his voice sharp. "Find her. The baker from the gala. I need her file." His assistant hesitated, sensing the edge in his tone, but complied. By noon, a slim folder sat on his desk. Clara Emerson. 31. Single mother. Owner of a small bakery in a town 2 hours from the city. A daughter, Lily, age 6. The words blurred as he read them, his pulse hammering. 6 years. The math was a blade, slicing through his certainty. He stared at the photo clipped to the file, Clara and a girl with dark curls and eyes that mirrored his own. His hands shook. It couldn't be. He drove to her town that evening, the city fading into fields and quiet streets. The bakery was a modest shop, its sign faded, its windows warm with light. He parked across the street, watching as Clara moved behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour. A bell jingled, and a girl ran in, Lily, her laughter bright, her face alive with joy. Nathaniel's chest tightened. She was his. He knew it the way you know a truth you've been running from. But when he stepped out of the car, his resolve faltered. What could he say? What right did he have? He didn't approach her that day. Instead, he returned to the city, the photo from the file burning a hole in his pocket. He hired a private investigator, not to spy, but to understand. The reports came in fragments. Clara's mother had died shortly after their breakup. She'd moved to escape the city's weight, raising Lily alone. She worked late, saved every penny, and never spoke of Lily's father. Nathaniel read each word like a confession, each detail a mirror to his failures. He'd abandoned her, and she'd built a life without him. But Lily was his daughter, and he'd missed 6 years of her life. Weeks passed, and Nathaniel became a ghost in his own world. Meetings bored him. Deals felt empty. He'd sit in his office, staring at the photo, replaying that night by the campfire. "You're trouble," he told her, and she'd grinned. Now, trouble was all he felt, trouble in his chest, in his dreams, in the truth he couldn't outrun. He started driving to her town more often, watching from a distance. He saw Clara walk Lily to school, her hand tight around her daughter's. He saw Lily draw on the bakery's chalkboard, her smile a light he didn't deserve. Each glimpse was a wound, but he couldn't stop. One evening, he found himself at the bakery's door. It was late, the shop empty except for Clara, who was sweeping the floor. The bell jingled as he entered, and she looked up, her face paling. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped forward, his throat tight. "Clara, he stopped, the words crumbling. Her eyes searched his, wary but not cold. "What do you want?" she asked, and the question was a wall. He pulled the photo from his pocket, his hands unsteady. "Is she mine?" The words hung between them, raw and jagged. Clara's broom clattered to the floor. She didn't move, didn't breathe, but her eyes filled with something that broke him. Pain, yes, but also a fierce protectiveness. "You don't get to ask that," she said, her voice low, trembling. "Not after 7 years. Not after you walked away." "I didn't know," he said, and it sounded weak, even to him. "Clara, I didn't know about her." She laughed, a bitter sound that cut deeper than any blade. "You didn't want to know. You made that clear." She turned away, her hands gripping the counter. "Lily's mine. She's always been mine. You don't get to claim her now because you're curious." He stepped closer, desperate. "I'm not claiming her. I need to know her. I need to make this right." Clara spun to face him, her eyes blazing. "Right? You think you can waltz in here with your money, your guilt, and fix this? She doesn't know you. She doesn't need you. And her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling over. "I needed you once. And you weren't there." The words were a gut punch. Nathaniel stood frozen, the photo still in his hand, Lily's face staring up at him. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was the first time he'd meant it, truly meant it, in years. Clara shook her head, wiping her eyes. "Sorry doesn't change anything. Go back to your world, Nathaniel. Leave us alone." She walked to the door, holding it open, and he had no choice but to leave. The night air was cold, but it was nothing compared to the chill in his bones. He drove back to the city, the photo on the passenger seat, Clara's words echoing in his head. He'd lost her once because of pride, because of fear. Now, he'd lost her again, and Lily with her. But as he stared at the skyline, its lights mocking his emptiness, something shifted. He wasn't the man he'd been 7 years ago. He wasn't sure who he was anymore, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't give up. The next day, he canceled a board meeting, ignoring the stunned looks from his team. He drove to a small shop in the city, one that sold art supplies, and bought a sketchbook and crayons. He didn't know why, not exactly, but he remembered Lily's drawings on the chalkboard, the way her hands moved with purpose. He mailed them to the bakery, no note, no name, just a silent offering. It was small, insignificant against the years he'd missed, but it was a start. He didn't know if Clara would accept it, if Lily would ever know him. But for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Vance was willing to try. The town was quiet in the late afternoon, its streets dappled with the soft light of autumn. Nathaniel Vance stood at the edge of a small park, his hands in his pockets, his heart a tangle of hope and fear. He'd been coming here for weeks, not to confront Clara, but to be near her world, to understand the life she'd built without him. The bakery was visible from here, its warm glow a beacon in the fading day. He'd sent the sketchbook and crayons months ago, then a picture book, then a scarf for Clara when the weather turned cold. Small gestures, anonymous, but each one a step toward atonement. He didn't know if she'd kept them, didn't know if she'd even guessed they were from him. But he kept trying, driven by a need he couldn't name. Today was different. He'd heard about a community event, a harvest fair where Clara's bakery was selling pastries. He hadn't planned to go, but his feet carried him here, to this park where children laughed and leaves crunched underfoot. He stood by a wooden bench, watching from a distance as Clara set up her stall, her movements quick but graceful. Lily was there, too, her dark curls bouncing as she helped arrange cookies on a tray. Nathaniel's chest ached at the sight of her, at the life in her eyes, so like his own yet entirely her own. He wanted to know her, not as a claim, but as a privilege he hadn't earned. He almost turned away, afraid of disrupting their peace, when a small figure broke from the crowd. Lily, clutching a paper plate with a half-eaten cookie, ran toward the park's swings. She tripped, her plate tumbling to the grass, and Nathaniel moved before he could think. He knelt beside her, picking up the cookie, brushing dirt from her sleeve. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer than he'd meant. Lily looked up, her eyes wide, curious, not afraid. "Yeah," she said, tilting her head. "You look like someone I drew once." His heart stopped. The sketchbook. Had she used it? Had she seen him in her lines, her colors? He swallowed, forcing a smile. "Maybe I'm just a guy who likes cookies." She giggled, a sound that felt like sunlight, and pointed at his tie. "You're fancy. Do you know my mom?" The question was innocent, but it cut deep. Before he could answer, Clara's voice called out, sharp with worry. "Lily." She was there in seconds, her face paling as she saw him. "Lily, come here," she said, her tone firm but trembling. Lily obeyed, but her eyes lingered on Nathaniel, curious, unguarded. Clara knelt to check her daughter, her hands steady but her breath uneven. When she stood, her gaze met his, and the air between them was heavy with unspoken years. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low, not accusing but guarded. "I didn't mean to," he stopped, searching for words that wouldn't break this fragile moment. "I just wanted to see her. To see you." Clara's eyes narrowed, but there was no anger now, only exhaustion, a weariness that mirrored his own. "You can't just show up, Nathaniel. Not like this." He nodded, his throat tight. "I know. I'm not here to take anything. I want to be better. For her. For you, if you'll let me." She looked away, her hands clutching Lily's shoulders. The fair hummed around them, oblivious to the weight of their silence. Lily tugged at Clara's sleeve. "Mom, he's nice. He saved my cookie." Clara's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile, but her eyes were wet. She looked at Nathaniel, really looked, and something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a crack in the wall she'd built. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why after all this time?" He pulled the photo from his pocket, the one of Lily by the campfire, its edges worn from months of carrying it. "Because of her," he said, holding it out. "Because I saw her, and I saw you in her, and I realized I've been running from the only thing that ever mattered." Clara took the photo, her fingers trembling as she traced Lily's face. You don't know her, she whispered. You don't know what it's been like. He stepped closer, his voice breaking. I know. And I can't undo that. But I'm here now, Clara. I'll keep being here, as long as it takes. Lily, sensing the tension, slipped her hand into Nathaniel's, her touch small but certain. Are you staying for the fair? She asked, oblivious to the storm in their eyes. Nathaniel looked at Clara, waiting for her to decide. She exhaled, a shaky breath, and nodded, just once. He can stay, she said to Lily, but her eyes never left his. For now. They walked back to the stall together, Lily between them, her chatter filling the silence. Nathaniel carried a tray for Clara, his hands unsteady but his heart steady for the first time in years. The fair was alive with laughter, but for him, there was only this: Clara's quiet strength, Lily's boundless joy, the fragile possibility of a future he didn't deserve but would fight for. When Clara handed him a cookie, her fingers brushing his, she didn't pull away. Champagne, she said softly, so only he could hear, and the word was a bridge, not a promise, but a start. As the sun dipped low, casting gold over the park, Nathaniel felt the weight of his old life slip away. He wasn't the man who'd walked away 7 years ago, nor the one who'd stood before a table of CEOs, confessing his sins. He was just a man, standing beside a woman and a girl who might one day call him something more. The photo of Lily by the campfire was still in Clara's hand, its light catching the last rays of the day. It wasn't an ending, but a beginning, one he'd spend the rest of his life earning.